Hey, everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into something today that a lot of people have been talking about.
Yeah, it's been all over the news.
The NCAA's new policy on transgender athletes.
Big changes, for sure.
Yeah, we got a bunch of your requests to cover this, so we're going to try to break it all down for you today. We've got some excerpts from a recent article all about this policy change.
Let's get into it.
Yeah, we're going to really unpack the details, see what's going on, and figure out what this means for college athletics.
Sounds good.
So to start things off, this new policy, it basically bans transgender women from competing in women's sports.
Exactly. That's the big headline here.
Yeah.
A total ban on transgender women competing in women's sports at the collegiate level.
Okay, so that means that any athlete who wants to compete in women's sports in the NCAA has to have been assigned female at birth.
That's how the policy puts it. Assigned female at birth. That's the new requirement for competing on a women's team.
Got it. This applies to all NCAA schools.
All of them.
Yeah.
Every single one across all sports, no exception.
Wow, okay. So no wiggle room there?
Nope. This is a nationwide standard. The NCAA is making it clear that this applies everywhere.
So what was the reasoning behind such a big change?
Well, the NCAA,
Okay.
they've said that they needed a clear and consistent standard across all the schools.
Okay. So a uniform standard for every...
Exactly. They want to get rid of all the different rules and court decisions.
Yeah, all the different state laws and all that.
Yeah, exactly. All that variation.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I mean, it's tough to have a national organization with so many different rules in different places.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So, okay, nationwide standard. But this policy, doesn't it only affect a tiny number of athletes?
Yeah, it's a very small number.
What happens to them?
Yeah.
What about their athletic dreams and their place on their teams? It's a huge shift for those few athletes.
Oh, absolutely. It's a massive change for them. Think about it. You're talking about something that's central to who they are, their identity, their passion. It's not just about policy for these athletes.
Right.
This is their life. And yeah, it only affects a small percentage, less than 10 out of over 530,000 athletes, according to the NCAA president. But still, for those 10, it's a huge deal.
Absolutely. And this new policy, it's effective right away, right?
Immediate. No exceptions.
So even those who were previously eligible under older guidelines.
It doesn't matter. It applies to every athlete right now.
Wow. Okay. So that's a pretty clear line.
Yeah.
And another thing that's kind of interesting is that the men's category is still open to anyone.
Right. Anyone can compete in men's sports.
The women's category is restricted to
only those assigned female at birth.
That's a pretty stark difference.
It is. It raises some interesting questions about how this will all play out in practice, literally.
Yeah. So the articles we got mentioned something about practice, what are the rules surrounding transgender women and practicing with their teams?
Yeah, so it gets a little more complicated there. The policy says that transgender women can still practice with the women's teams. And they can still get all the same benefits as other athletes. They just can't compete in the actual games.
Oh, so they can practice but not play in games.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like a mixed gender practice squad situation, which isn't actually that unusual in some sports.
Right. Think about UConn women's basketball. Gino Auriemma has been having his teams practice with men for years to really push them and challenge them.
Yeah, and look how successful they've been.
Exactly. It's a common strategy in some sports.
So it seems like this new policy is kind of highlighting all these complexities about gender in sports.
Yeah, it's definitely bringing some important questions to the forefront.
But hold on, what about athletes who might be going through hormone therapy?
Good question.
Like testosterone treatments. Where do they fit into all of this?
So the NCAA has specific rules about that, too. If a female athlete who was assigned female at birth starts taking testosterone or other hormone therapy, they can't compete on a women's team anymore, but they can still practice with the team.
So practice is okay, but competition is?
Competition is where the line is drawn.
Interesting. So if a female athlete who's on hormone therapy wants to rejoin the women's team,
that's where things get really tricky. The NCAA is going to have to figure out how to evaluate eligibility in those cases, and it's not clear how that's all going to work yet.
So a lot of this is still uncharted territory.
Exactly. And to understand where the NCAA is coming from with this whole thing, we need to look at President Trump's executive order.
Oh, right, because that seems to be a driving force behind this change.
Yeah, it's definitely connected. So this executive order, basically, it bans transgender women from competing in women's sports at the national level.
Okay, so how does this executive order relate to Title IX?
Well, the Trump administration is interpreting Title IX in a way that defines sex based on the sex assigned at birth.
So it's not about gender identity?
Not according to this interpretation.
No. So basically, schools could lose federal funding if they allow transgender women to compete in women's sports.
That's the idea. And it goes even further. The executive order actually directs the Secretary of State to tell the International Olympic Committee that America rejects what President Trump calls transgender lunacy.
Wow, so he's using pretty strong language there, especially considering that the International Olympic Committee already has its own guidelines for transgender athletes that are more lenient than this.
It's definitely a contrast, and this executive order is part of a larger pattern we've been seeing with President Trump. He's been issuing several executive orders targeting diversity and inclusion initiatives, and he's also been trying to restrict gender-affirming care for young people.
So it seems like this whole NCAA policy is really just one piece of a much larger and very controversial conversation about transgender rights and how they intersect with athletics. And I'm guessing there's some pretty strong opinions on both sides of this.
Oh, absolutely. You've got people who fully support the NCAA's decision, and then others who are very concerned about fairness and inclusivity and the impact this could have on transgender athletes. We'll dive into all of those reactions in more detail after a quick break.
Okay, so we're back. And before the break, we were getting into those strong reactions to the NCAA's policy change. It's clear that this is a pretty complex issue,
Definitely.
with good points being made on both sides.
Yeah, there are valid arguments all over the place.
So let's break down those arguments. What are some of the arguments in favor of this NCAA policy change?
Well, a lot of the support is coming from President Trump's base and those who believe that having transgender women compete in women's sports creates an unfair advantage.
Okay, so they're saying it's about fairness
Mhm.
and in making sure that cisgender women aren't at a disadvantage.
Right, and their arguments usually center around the idea that transgender women might have physical advantages because of biological differences.
So essentially, they're saying that biology plays a big role in athletic performance and that allowing transgender women to compete alongside cisgender women could compromise fair competition.
Yeah, that's the basic argument. But you could also argue that it's not quite that simple. There are a lot of factors that go into athletic performance, like training and skill level and just individual variations.
Right, exactly. It's not just about biology.
But the people who support the ban, they tend to prioritize those potential biological advantages.
Got it. So it's all about how much weight you give to those biological differences.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's one side of the argument. What about the other side? What are some of the concerns that people who are against this policy have?
So a lot of LGBTQ plus advocacy groups and allies are saying that this policy is discriminatory and harmful to transgender athletes.
Right.
They're saying that transgender women are women and they should be able to compete in accordance with their gender identity, just like any other athlete.
So for them, it's not about any potential physical advantages.
No, it's about recognizing and respecting gender identity and making sure that everyone has equal opportunities.
Right. And they're also concerned about the message this sends to transgender women.
Yeah, it basically tells them they're not welcome in women's sports.
It kind of reinforces that feeling of being marginalized and excluded.
Exactly. And that can have a real impact on their mental health and well-being.
Yeah.
Imagine being told you can't play the sport you love because of who you are.
That's got to be tough.
It is. It's a really difficult situation.
Yeah.
So yeah, this whole debate, it goes way beyond just athletics.
Yeah, it's about fundamental questions of identity and inclusion and how we treat transgender individuals in our society.
Exactly. You said it perfectly. It's about so much more than just sports.
And it's not just an abstract policy debate either.
Right. This has real consequences for real people.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? What are the potential long-term implications of all of this, both for college athletics and for this broader discussion about transgender athletes?
Well, I think we're going to see more legal challenges.
To the NCAA policy and to President Trump's executive order.
To both, yeah. And we're already seeing different states considering their own laws that either support or oppose transgender participation in sports. So this is going to be a hot button issue for a while.
Yeah, it definitely seems like this back and forth is going to continue.
Oh, for sure. And this NCAA policy could also have an impact on other sports organizations.
Like a ripple effect.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
Other organizations might start adopting similar policies.
So it could really change the landscape of transgender inclusion in sports across the board.
It could. And this whole situation raises some fundamental questions, like how do we define fairness and inclusion in sports?
Right. How do we balance all of these different interests and perspectives?
Exactly. It's a tough conversation to have.
Yeah, no easy answers. It feels like we're at a turning point in how we think about gender in athletics.
We are. It's a challenging time, but it's also a really important time to have these discussions.
Absolutely. And it's important to approach this issue with empathy and understanding,
Yes, we need to be willing to listen to each other and try to find some common ground.
even if we don't agree on everything.
Exactly. We need to create spaces for respectful dialogue.
I agree. So before we wrap up, I want to turn the conversation over to you, our listener. What do you think about all of this?
How do you think this new policy will impact college athletics and this whole conversation about transgender inclusion in sports?
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. We've given you the facts and the different perspectives. Now it's up to you to form your own opinion.
We hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought.
We encourage you to keep learning and keep asking questions and keep engaging in these important conversations. This is an evolving situation, so stay informed and stay engaged.
Absolutely. Stay curious and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
We've covered a lot of ground today. This whole NCAA policy thing, it's a lot to take in.
It is. So many different angles to think about.
Yeah. So before we wrap things up, let's do a quick recap of what we've learned about this new policy and what it all means.
Okay. Sounds
So the main takeaway here is that the NCAA has made a pretty big decision.
Yeah, big change for sure.
They've put in place this new policy that bans transgender women from competing in women's sports. And this is in line with President Trump's executive order.
Right. It all goes back to that interpretation of Title IX.
Yeah, defining sex based on the sex assigned at birth.
Exactly.
And this new policy, it applies to all NCAA schools and all sports.
Yep, across the board.
So it's a pretty significant change, even though it only directly affects a small number of athletes.
True. But it sets a precedent.
Yeah, and it really draws a clear line between men's and women's sports.
For sure, men's sports are open to anyone.
But women's sports are now limited to those athletes who were assigned female at birth.
That's the new rule.
We also talked about how this policy affects practice and participation.
Yeah, that's where things get a little nuanced.
Transgender women can't compete, but they can still practice with their teams and receive all the same benefits as other athletes.
Which is interesting because some sports already do that anyway. You know, they use mixed gender practice squads as a training strategy.
Yeah, it's a way to challenge athletes and help them improve.
Exactly.
But we can't forget that this whole issue has sparked some really intense debate.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
There are strong feelings on both sides.
Definitely.
You've got supporters of the policy who are focused on fairness and biological differences.
And then you've got those who are against the policy, and they're concerned about inclusivity and transgender rights.
Right. And this debate, it goes way beyond just the world of sports.
It really does.
It touches on some really fundamental questions about gender identity and how we treat each other in our society,
It makes us think about what it means to be fair and inclusive.
and how we can create a world where everyone feels welcome and respected.
Exactly. It's a big conversation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question. What are your thoughts on all of this?
Yeah, we've given you the information, the context, and the different perspectives. Now it's your turn to think critically and form your own opinion.
We encourage you to stay informed and keep learning about this issue because it's not going away anytime soon.
It's an evolving situation, so stay engaged and keep those conversations going.
And most importantly, keep asking those tough questions. That's what it's all about. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.